Today, you're going to hear a true story, so absurd, it feels like fiction. But relax, because here, the strange helps you sleep. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and imagine an airport. Long corridors, suitcases sliding by, voices in different languages, departures, arrivals, and in the middle of it all, a man who arrived, but never left. For 18 years, Mehran Karimi Nasseri lived inside an airport, not as an employee, not as a passenger, but as someone without a country, without an identity, and without a destination. Trapped between departure and arrival, he turned a terminal into a home. And while thousands boarded flights to somewhere, he stayed, waiting. Body, introspective narrative. The clock showed an ordinary time in Paris. Outside, the weather was overcast. But inside Terminal 1 of Charles de Gaulle Airport, days had no clear beginning nor end. The artificial lights never went out. The flow of passengers never truly stopped. The airport moved to its own rhythm, suspended, almost like a dream that refuses to end. It was there that Mehran Karimi Nasseri arrived. He had come from Belgium. Before that, he'd passed through several countries, and even earlier, through many refusals. He claimed to be Iranian, a political dissident, a man on the run. But the documents he carried didn't tell a clear story. And in an instant, like the blink of an eye, everything that proved who he was disappeared. Some said he lost the papers, others that they were stolen. There are those who claim he destroyed them himself. The truth may have dissolved in time. What remained was the setting, and him, sitting on a plastic bench, surrounded by suitcases, watching life pass in halls that didn't belong to him, but didn't expel him either. There, arrival wasn't a moment. It was a state. The modern world is impersonal. It turns with the precision of a clock. Every passenger is a number, every bag a code, every face a name on a departure board. But Mehran was none of these data points. He was the exception, a man outside the system, outside time. At first, few noticed. He was just another among the many weary faces leaning back in seats, waiting for layovers that were far too long. But days went by, and he was still there, always in the same spot. Terminal 1, with its cold glass and polished floors, became the frame of his existence. He slept on benches, bathed in public restrooms, and ate whatever he could, sometimes leftovers from passengers, sometimes the occasional kindness of staff. Over time, he earned the informal nickname Sir Alfred, a joke that became an identity, because without documents, without a passport, without a home, he became whatever the space allowed, a silent, discreet, and strangely permanent figure. Someone who was there, but wasn't supposed to be. Someone who arrived, but never managed to leave. Have you ever noticed how airports are places of waiting? No one lives in an airport. No one truly belongs there. But Mehran stayed, as if waiting had become his way of living, as if, by being forbidden to go, he had been freed from everything else. Hours stopped making sense. Life hung suspended between flights. While the world rushed on outside, with cars, calendars, and commitments, he remained quiet, observing, part of the scenery. And when night came, or what would have been night if there were a visible sky, he would lie down on his bench, pull the red suitcase close, and fall asleep to the sound of boarding calls, as if waiting for a call that would never come. Most people, when boarding a plane, have no idea they are about to take part in a ritual. There's the ticket, the gate, the electronic voice calling passengers to board, the narrow aisle, the numbered seat, and finally, the sound of the engine gathering strength until it slices through the sky. But Mehran Karimi Nasseri never reached that moment. What he had was the promise of a flight, a destination that remained only in theory, and a ticket that led him nowhere. The year was 1988. Nasseri had traveled through several countries, trying to find refuge. He claimed to be a political refugee, said he had been expelled from Iran for ideological reasons, a story tangled in confusing documents and names of institutions that alternately confirmed and denied his account. In Belgium, he received a form of recognition. The UN granted him a temporary refugee certificate, a piece of paper that, in theory, would allow him to travel through certain European countries. With that document in hand, he tried to continue his journey. Destination, London. But something happened. Somewhere between connections and transfers, between one station and the next, his papers disappeared. There are different versions of this episode. Some say his briefcase was stolen, others that he lost it by accident. There are even those who claim that, in a moment of desperation or defiance, he destroyed the documents himself. No one knows for sure, and perhaps, with time, neither did he. What is certain is that, upon arriving at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, with London as his final destination, he was stopped. No passport, no valid identification, no proof of who he was, no proof of where he was headed. The British authorities refused him entry, saying he could not enter without proper documentation. The French authorities, in turn, did not want to accept him either. Yes, he had boarded a plane, but now he was no longer welcome anywhere. And so, in just a few hours, Mehran went from being a passenger to being a problem. In the cold logic of bureaucratic systems, he did not exist. He was a name without a face without a nation, a man between borders, trapped in a space that, technically, did not belong to any country. Terminal 1 at Charles de Gaulle Airport is not, legally, fully French territory. Technically, it is an international zone. And there, in that neutral territory, he was left. No entry, no exit. At first, he believed it would be temporary. He waited for someone to come and resolve the impasse. A staff member, a diplomat, a lawyer. But days turned into weeks, and nothing changed. He was briefly taken to a detention area, and then returned to the terminal. Just like that. Like a package without a label. Like lost luggage no one bothers to claim. The ticket that was supposed to take him to England became a tragic metaphor. A ticket to nowhere. He could no longer board, and neither could he go back. Iran did not recognize him. France claimed he was not legally on their territory. Belgium, which had issued his previous documents, refused to take him back. It was as if the entire world had joined in a cruel game of hot potato. Each country saw him as someone else's problem. And in the middle of this cold diplomacy stood a man. Hungry, tired, and eerily calm. At some point, Nasseri understood. That flight would not take off. Not that day. Not the next. Perhaps never. He gathered his few belongings, a red suitcase, some papers, a blanket, and settled onto one of the benches in Terminal 1. There, where people once waited only for moments, he began to wait for years. With every flight announcement, something in his gaze seemed to stir. But it was a silent stir, almost imperceptible. Like someone secretly still hoping their name will be called over the loudspeaker. And while time slipped by like hurried travelers rushing down the corridors, he remained. His flight was no longer a plane. It was the very idea of being able to leave. And that idea had been cancelled. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when something imperceptible becomes definitive. Like when a guest starts to feel like a resident, or when a pause turns into abandonment. As the weeks passed, Mehran Karimi Nasseri no longer drew much attention at Charles de Gaulle Airport. Staff had grown accustomed to his quiet presence. Passengers, rushing between flights, rarely noticed the man who always sat in the same seat. He didn't bother anyone. He didn't ask for anything. He was simply there, as if he were part of the space itself. That's the strange power of repetition. When something happens long enough, it starts to feel natural. Nasseri woke up early. He brushed his teeth in public restrooms. He kept his belongings carefully stored in a red suitcase that never left his side. He arranged the space around him as if marking territory. A corner in the terminal, under the artificial glow of fluorescent lights, became his refuge. There, time stopped being measurable. Days were no longer days. And nights, well, in an airport, night never truly darkens. The loudspeakers announced flights to places he would never reach. Madrid, Tokyo, Sao Paulo. With every metallic voice, a reminder of what he could not live. With every departure, an echo of the outside world, that world which refused him entry. But he did not protest. He didn't shout. Nor did he cry in public. He simply remained. It was as if he had been erased from the human map. No country, no home, no legal identity. And yet, visibly there. Perhaps the most painful part was not the exile itself, but the fact that he was ignored while standing fully in everyone's field of vision. The exile of the invisible. Have you ever imagined living in a place that, by definition, is temporary? A space made for transit, for haste, for farewells, and there, making it your home? There are no doors to close in a terminal, no windows to open to the sky, no corners of complete silence, only movement, and within it, a man standing still. Over time, Nasseri learned the rhythms of the environment. He knew when night flights slowed down. He knew which staff passed by which gate, and at what time. He knew where it was warmest to sleep, and which vending machine was the most generous. He began to write. He scribbled thoughts, memories, and reflections into notebooks he guarded as closely as his suitcase. In them, he recorded the daily life of the non-place, a chronicle of modern exile, written without a voice, without an address, without a horizon. Staff began to recognize his face. Some, over time, offered small gestures, a piece of fruit, a coffee, a smile. But never too much. Never intimacy. Just a nod, like acknowledging a strange yet familiar part of the scenery. Sometimes he was noticed by curious passengers, but few lingered, because something about that quiet figure brought discomfort. Perhaps it was a reminder that the world has no place for everyone. And even in the midst of that absence of everything, Mehran created a routine. He dressed with dignity, read newspapers left behind on chairs, wrote in silence, ate what he could, and slept to the sound of announcements as if they were lullabies in the language of machines. There was no key, no bed, but there was constancy, and that was enough for that terminal to become, for lack of choice, or by force of habit, a home without a roof, without walls, without belonging to it. This is how Mehran's invisible exile was born. Not a classical banishment, like in books, but a bureaucratic disappearance, an administrative vanishing. He wasn't taken far away. He was simply left in the middle of everyone, and of no one. There is something profoundly modern about this kind of exile. It is not carried out with chains, nor with walls, but with systems, with lost documents, denied visas, countries washing their hands. It is the loneliness of hyperconnection, where one can go anywhere, except when one cannot go anywhere at all. Have you ever noticed how, when you live long enough in a place, that place starts to change? Not in appearance, but in meaning. It's as if, little by little, the space begins to recognize you. What was once strange becomes habit. What was once temporary becomes routine. That's how it was with Mehran Karimi Nasseri. Over time, Terminal 1 at Charles de Gaulle Airport ceased to be just a hall of departures and arrivals, and became territory, a parallel world, with its own rules, with invisible borders. There, amid convenience stores, luggage carts, and cold benches, something unlikely emerged. a sort of informal republic, without a flag, without a constitution, but with a single inhabitant and king. They called him, with a kind of comical reverence, Sir Alfred. No one knew for sure where the name came from. Some say Nasseri himself renamed himself, trying to reinvent himself within exile. Others believe it was a nickname given by staff, one that simply stuck. But the fact is, he adopted it. Sir Alfred, a knight's name, the name of someone important, someone with a story, and in a way, the title suited him. Because within that inhospitable space, Nasseri had created a microcosm. His bench was the throne, his red suitcase, the vault, the corridors, his avenues, the bathrooms, his improvised thermal baths, and the flight boards, his window to a world he no longer touched, but still watched from afar. The routine was meticulous. He woke at the same time every day, arranged his belongings with almost ceremonial precision, cleaned the space around him, sat with poise, like someone who knows they are being observed, even if they aren't. Over time, he became a familiar figure. Employees greeted him with a nod. Security guards stopped approaching him. Some shopkeepers, discreetly, would offer him leftover food at the end of the day. Not out of pity, but more like recognizing an old neighbor. It was curious to see how the space adapted to him. Even without documents, he existed. Even without a home, he was at home, and the Republic of Terminal 1 had its own laws. Laws not created by decree, but by necessity. He no longer concerned himself with wanting to leave. That battle had dissolved over time. Now, it was about enduring, staying clean, even without a shower. Staying sane, even without a purpose. Staying alive, even without freedom. Most of the time, he spoke to no one. A silent ruler of his own domain. He observed. He wrote. He waited. Sometimes, he drew imaginary maps of the terminal. Other times, he recorded small details. Flight names, strangers' conversations, recurring noises. It was as if he were studying the world from within that microcosm. And so, his presence became part of the place. Tourists took photos of him in secret. Some, bolder, tried to talk. But he didn't give much room for that. He liked to keep his dignity, and perhaps the mystery. He was the silent symbol of something no one wanted to face. The failure of bureaucracy, the cruelty of systems. Modern loneliness disguised as mobility. Within that republic without people, Sir Alfred was both head of state and its only citizen. No political crisis, no election, no opposition, and in some way, that gave him power. There are those who say that, over time, he grew comfortable there. That exile became a choice. But was it really? Or was it that, when everything around you insists on forgetting you, the only way out is to invent a world where you still exist? There are places where time seems to behave differently, where seconds don't move in a straight line, but form a slow, repetitive, almost hypnotic circle. Airports are like that. At every moment, there is movement. People say goodbye. Others arrive. Suitcases glide quickly across the polished floor. Coffees are served. Announcements echo in metallic voices. Everything beats to a rhythm of urgency. And yet, amid this whirlwind, there are islands of silence. Mehran Karimi Nasseri occupied one of those islands. Day after day, he remained seated in the same chairs. Those metal seats, lined up side by side, designed for the brief, never for the lasting. They don't embrace you. They don't comfort you. But even so, he turned them into home. There, where the world revolves around boarding, he stayed still. Not by choice, but by the absence of it. And in this paradoxical setting, life began to take on a curious shape. An existence built on observation. Have you ever stopped to watch an airport from the inside? Not as a passenger, but as someone who isn't going anywhere? That's what Mehran learned to do. While everyone rushed to their gates, he watched. While faces crossed the terminal for mere seconds, he memorized them. While voices passed in languages he might never understand, he listened. And among the noises, the silence was born. Not a silence of absence, but an inner silence. The kind that only comes when you stop expecting change. When you accept that the movement of the world no longer includes you. Even so, there was beauty in the repetition. The faces changed, but the emotions were the same. Smiles of reunion, tears of farewell, looks of haste, sighs of relief. And in all of them, Mehran saw mirrors. Reflections of a life that, with a small twist of fate, could have been his own. The metal seats became an extension of his body. Every armrest, every scratch on the upholstery, every stain on the floor, all of it was part of his world. It was an improvised home between noise and concrete. Every now and then, a passenger would sit beside him. Perhaps from fatigue, perhaps out of distraction, and they would remain there, side by side, for minutes, sharing the same space, but living in different realities. The passenger thought about the flight, the schedule, the destination. Mehran thought about time, about silence, about the absence of a destination. And when the stranger stood up to leave, he stayed, as if each departure only reinforced his own permanence. There's a kind of loneliness that can only exist in the middle of a crowd. It's the feeling of being ignored not out of cruelty, but out of distraction. Because no one expects to find a man living in an airport. No one imagines that, behind that quiet face, there is a story, a pain, a waiting that has long since become habit. And so, Mehran learned to fade away, to become invisible, to move little, to take up no space. He was almost like a ghost, present but unnoticed, real but unacknowledged. But ghosts observe too, and over time he began to record details. He didn't just write about himself, but about others, about the passengers who came and went, about the small dramas he witnessed in silence. A long embrace between mother and daughter, a man quietly crying on the phone, a child enchanted by the reflection of light on the polished floor. He saw it all. He wrote it all down, like someone who, without moving, traveled through the lives of others. In almost every known picture of Mehran Karimi Nasseri, there's a recurring detail. By his side, a suitcase. Not one of those discreet, modern designs with silent wheels, but an old suitcase, red, large enough to hold a life, or merely its echo. The suitcase was always kept close, never far away, never left in a corner. It slept beside Mehran, served as a support for his writings, as a symbolic shield, as the literal and metaphorical weight of everything he had carried up to that point. But what was inside it? No one knew for sure. Some said it held his original documents. Others believed it contained clothes and small personal belongings. There were even those who thought that inside it lay everything that tied him to his past. Photos, notes, fragments of the man he had been before becoming simply the man of the airport. And maybe it was all of that together, or none of it, because the red suitcase was not just an object. It was a symbol, a condensed story. The only physical trace of an identity dissolved by bureaucracy. Have you noticed how certain objects seem to absorb the memory of those who carry them? A suitcase, for example, usually holds promises. It carries what is necessary for a crossing. It is prepared for movement, for departure. It exists because there is, or there would be, a journey. But what happens when the journey never comes? Mehran's suitcase became a capsule of permanence. Instead of being an instrument of travel, it became an anchor, a constant reminder of everything he could not do. And at the same time, it was also a refuge. Inside it were his writings, his ideas, his memories, real or reconstructed. It was his identity box, and protecting it meant protecting the little that was left of himself. That's why he never opened it in public, not in front of passengers, not in front of staff. As if its contents were sacred, untouchable, as if the mere act of opening it could break the fragile structure he still maintained. The man and the suitcase formed a set, almost as if they were part of each other, a body at rest, bound to a motionless soul. And over the years, the red suitcase stopped being just a detail. It became his trademark. Everyone knew, wherever the suitcase was, Mehran was there. Even if he wasn't visible at that moment, even if he was lying down, withdrawn, hidden behind some partition, because the suitcase was always there, steady, silent, present, and perhaps that presence was what hurt the most, because it symbolized something that never happened. It was waiting, encapsulated, a farewell frozen in time. Mehran was no longer a traveler, but his suitcase still was, as if they lived in different rhythms. He had stopped. It still dreamed of departure. There was something deeply poetic and tragic in that. From afar, one might think it was just forgotten luggage. But that suitcase was not forgotten. It was a constant reminder of everything he had lost and of everything he still carried. Living in an airport is something very different from simply being in one. For passengers, it's a place of transition, where time is only an interval between the past and the destination. Everything there is temporary. A quick coffee before boarding, a brief glance at a souvenir shop window, an uncomfortable nap on plastic chairs. But for Mehran Karimi Nasseri, that concourse was, for 18 years, all he had. And within that forced permanence, a routine was born. There was no kitchen, no shower, no bed, no pillow, no comfort of any kind found in a home. And yet, Mehran found ways to live, to carry on, to endure in silence. He woke early every day, with the first hurried footsteps of travelers and the chime of announcements over the loudspeakers. There were no blinds, no darkness before dawn. Artificial light was eternal, and night was only a vague concept. To keep clean, he used the public restrooms of Terminal 1 at Charles de Gaulle Airport. He washed his face in the sink. When possible, he would change clothes right there, discreetly, with small, almost invisible movements. Full baths were rare. They depended on the goodwill of staff or quick opportunities, a larger, emptier restroom, a brief window of time. He carried with him a small toiletry bag containing a worn toothbrush, a bar of soap wrapped in paper, and an old comb. It was little, but it was enough to preserve, day after day, the dignity of someone who refuses to disappear. Eating was also a constant challenge. During the first months, Mehran bought simple food at the terminal snack bars, cold sandwiches, small portions of fries, cheap sodas. But over time, and with no income, he had to find other solutions. Some airport employees, moved by the silent constancy of the man, began offering complimentary meals. Not every day, but often enough to keep hope alive. There was also the discreet charity of passengers. Someone who left a tray with leftovers on a table. Another who offered a hot drink. These were timid gestures, often wordless. Small acts of relief for someone who no longer expected them. Over time, Mehran developed a trained eye for spotting moments. He knew when to approach without causing discomfort. He knew when to step back, when to seem busy, when to disappear among the columns of metal and glass. And even under such conditions, he maintained a serene composure. He sat at a table with his elbows close, his eyes lowered, his face calm. He did not eat in a rush. He savored, even if it was little, because for him, it was not just food. It was symbolic survival. It was a way of continuing to exist. He wrote, always, on loose sheets, with borrowed pens, in notebooks he was given. He drafted long accounts of his life, his beliefs, his rights. He even created a handwritten autobiography, which he claimed was proof of his true identity. And while the world around him spun, with departures and arrivals, families reuniting, rushed farewells, suitcases coming and going, he remained silent, observant, present. There was no one to charge him rent, but he paid with time. There was no key to lock up his things, but he guarded them with a watchful eye. And though invisible to most, there were those who noticed him. Over the years, Mehran became almost part of the landscape, a familiar face to employees, a name whispered among security guards, a living myth to frequent travelers. And still, he remained discreet, without asking, without demanding, without intruding. Surviving in such a place is not only a matter of adaptation, it is a form of philosophy. It is accepting time as it is. It is making the limbo a livable place. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable thing. There is a certain kind of hope that is silent. It does not shout. It does not show off. It is written with a steady hand, with blue ink on white paper, and often it receives no reply. After adapting to the routine, after making the terminal his silent refuge, Mehran Karimi Nasseri began living between two realities: the suspended present inside the airport, and the future he tried to provoke through letters. Letters to governments, letters to embassies, letters to lawyers, letters even to the Queen of England. Each one was written patiently, with a formal, almost ceremonial vocabulary, as if asking for permission to exist. Mehran would introduce himself, explain his case, tell his story, that complex web of expulsions, refusals, and missing documents. He spoke of Iran, Belgium, and France. He gathered every name, every protocol number, every possible version of his identity. And then he waited. Time for him was always the same, but waiting took on a different texture when an answer was possible. Sometimes an envelope would arrive, with crests, stamps, and important seals, but almost always the words inside were cold. Refusals, bureaucratic silences, doors that closed with polite indifference. Unfortunately, it is not possible to grant the request. Insufficient documentation, irregular situation, outside jurisdiction. And hope, silent as it was, would shrink a little more. But it would not die. He would write again, with small variations, new arguments, other recipients, always at the same table, among suitcases and trays, surrounded by voices that did not know his name. In a curious and deeply symbolic moment, Mehran even received an offer to leave the airport. It was Belgium that offered a document that would allow him entry. But there was one condition. He would have to live in Belgian territory under the supervision of a social worker. And more importantly, he had to agree to be registered as an Iranian citizen. But Mehran refused. Yes, he said no to the chance of freedom, because for him, accepting that identity was to deny his own story. He said he was not Iranian. He said his documents had been destroyed, that he was stateless, a citizen of nowhere. And so, he stayed where he was. The refusal was not made in anger, nor in despair. It was serene, like all his decisions. He believed that the truth, sooner or later, would be revealed, that the world would correct the mistake, that his real name, Sir Alfred Mehran, as he introduced himself, would at last be recognized. And in that weaving of attempts and refusals, his life went on, year after year, always between letters and replies, between passports that never came and doors that never opened. From time to time, airport staff tried to help him. They spoke to social services, contacted lawyers. But the machinery of bureaucracy is slow, and it does not move out of compassion. To the system, Mehran was an error, a statistical anomaly, a man out of place, both literally and symbolically. But to those who looked closely, he was something more. He was the resistance of an individual against the impersonal machinery of nations. He was the refusal to be labeled by papers. He was the insistence on existing with his own identity, even without documents. And at that point, his story was no longer just about a man trapped in an airport. It became the story of someone who chose to remain true to himself, even when it meant staying alone. Letters, rejections, and closed doors were not just obstacles. They were also witnesses to his voice, to his persistence, to his choice not to be shaped. Terminal 1 of Charles de Gaulle Airport is a world in itself. A place where thousands of people pass through every day, coming from all directions, going to all directions. But in the middle of that hurried back and forth, there was someone who wasn't going anywhere at all. To many, Mehran Karimi Nasseri was just a strange figure, a man sitting on a bench, surrounded by red suitcases, sometimes reading, sometimes writing, sometimes simply staring into nothing, as if waiting for time to dissolve. And even without saying a word, he was noticed. Because there are presences that don't ask for attention, they simply receive it. There was something in his posture, in the way he sat upright, in the serene and slightly melancholic expression that made travelers' eyes linger a few seconds longer. Some simply passed by, curious, intrigued, perhaps uncomfortable. Others, however, stopped and began a conversation. Are you waiting for someone? Do you live here? Do you need help? Mehran rarely told the whole story. Sometimes he gave a condensed version of it. Other times, he simply smiled and thanked them for their kindness. But little by little, between one exchanged glance and another, he became a living character of that space. Some passengers left coins, others sandwiches. There were even those who came back days later, just to see if he was still there. He was always on the same bench, with the same belongings, with the same calm. Children looked at him with curiosity, adults with strangeness or compassion, airport staff with a kind of restrained affection. Over time, he came to be called by a different name, not Mehran nor Sir Alfred, but the man of the terminal. There was an invisible tenderness between him and those who crossed his path. Even those who never asked his name felt that there was a story there, and indeed there was. A story that could not fit into labels, an existence that escaped common categories. While some traveled for meetings and business, Mehran remained still, but not indifferent. He observed everything. The way people said goodbye, the quick hugs, the tears held back at the boarding gates. He saw the rush of executives, the anxious looks of tourists, the hasty naps, the lost luggage, the delays. But he also saw moments of tenderness, families reuniting, couples embracing after months apart, shy smiles between strangers. It was as if, standing still there, he could see humanity in transit. And perhaps that's why Mehran was not, in fact, invisible. He was a mirror for anyone willing to truly look. Some journalists discovered his story. They came to interview him, published reports, and the more people talked about him, the greater the mystery grew. Who was this man? Why had he been there for so long? Why wouldn't he leave? The answers were always incomplete, but perhaps that didn't matter, because deep down, Mehran embodied something greater, the feeling of being in transit, without ever arriving, something that many passengers, even with tickets in hand, also felt. And in that silent exchange, between curious glances and brief words, Mehran wove connections. Ephemeral, yes, but real. Connections that reminded him every day that even without documents, he was still seen. Imagine waking up without knowing if it's Monday or Saturday, if it's morning or late afternoon, if time is moving forward or backwards. In Terminal 1 of Charles de Gaulle, there are no wide windows with views of the sky, no sun rising through the cracks, no scent of rain drifting in from the corners. In there, everything is controlled, artificial, eternally lit. And for Mehran Karimi Nasseri, time became something different, something not measured by hands on a clock, but by silences. The days repeated themselves, the same red bench, the same suitcases in the same spot, the same flight announcements, the same voices in the same languages. Time there was not a river flowing. It was a still lake, motionless, quiet, and yet he lived. Mehran began to build small, invisible milestones, gestures that to anyone else would seem trivial, but to him were points of anchorage. There was the moment to wake up, even without a clock. He could feel the airport's movement change. The number of people increased. The sounds became more rhythmic. Then came breakfast, not always with food. Sometimes just a sip of water, or a piece of bread left by a kind employee. Then, reading. Always reading. Forgotten newspapers. Abandoned magazines. Documents he would rewrite himself, in endless versions of his own story. He wrote letters that would never be sent. He rewrote his name, his origin, his future. It was as if, by writing, he tried to organize time, to give shape to something shapeless all around him. In the afternoon, he would watch people. He would spend hours looking at the escalator, faces passing by, suitcases moving, leather shoes, flip-flops, high heels. Every person seemed to be living something important, but he lived the invisible. At night, the airport never slept, but it slowed down. Voices became more spaced out, footsteps rarer. The lights, though still on, seemed dimmer, as if the airport itself were exhausted. Mehran slept on the bench, surrounded by his luggage. He used coats as pillows, covered his face with a sheet of newspaper, and sometimes he dreamed of empty airports. In his dreams, there were no flights, no departures, only long, endless corridors, where he walked slowly, uninterrupted. Over the years, Mehran lost track of how long he had been there. 5 years, 10, 15. The calendar stopped being a guide. It was just another forgotten piece of paper among many. But the body, that one remembered time. His hair grew thinner, his steps shorter, his eyes deeper, his beard sprinkled with more white hairs. But the habits, those stayed the same. Each morning he washed himself. Each night he slept in the same corner, always with an attentive gaze, always with a silence that spoke more than any speech. Time, for Mehran, stopped being an enemy. It became a companion, because when you have no hurry, no expectations, time doesn't scare you. It simply is. And perhaps that is what's most unsettling for those looking from the outside. The serenity of someone who lives suspended in midair, without complaining, without asking, without shouting, simply being. In the middle of a limbo. In an airport, people come and go. They board, disembark, cry, smile, say goodbye, reunite. But almost no one stays. Almost no one remains long enough to be noticed. Mehran stayed, and over time, his presence became impossible to ignore. He was discreet. He never caused trouble. He didn't beg. He didn't disrupt the flow. He just existed, like part of the architecture, like an extra bench in the hall. But attentive eyes noticed. The staff gradually recognized him. He was the man with the red suitcases, The man with the calm gaze. The man who read old newspapers and wrote on loose sheets of paper. He had no badge, no boarding pass. Yet he moved with the confidence of someone who knows every corner of the terminal. And more than that, with the lightness of someone who had already accepted his fate. The cleaning staff offered him cups of water. The security guards exchanged a bonjour with him from time to time. Some attendants discreetly left bread or fruit on the table beside him. It was as if the airport, in all its industrial impersonality, had developed a quiet affection for him. It wasn't exaggerated compassion. It wasn't overt charity. It was something else. It was recognition. Mehran was always clean, even with improvised baths. His clothes, however repeated, were neat. His suitcases, arranged like little portable wardrobes. He never raised his voice. And when he spoke, he did so with a politeness that stood out in the rushed environment. Slow words, an undefined accent, a gaze that always sought the horizon, even when there were no windows. Over time, passengers began to notice him too. Some, curious, approached. Others just whispered, pointing discreetly. "Does he live here?" they asked. "Why?" they murmured. And Mehran rarely answered. Sometimes he said something brief. He said he was waiting, that he was Iranian, or that he was waiting for documents. But he never told the whole story, not out of shame, but perhaps out of fatigue. His story was too long for a connection terminal, and he knew almost no one would have the time to truly hear it. Even so, Mehran began to become a living legend within that non-place. Staff told new employees about him. Tour guides whispered his name to foreign groups. Some journalism students came by just to see him with their own eyes. The European press, from time to time, returned to seek him out. They wanted to update the story, to know how someone was still there. The airport man made headlines, again and again, but he remained the same, sitting, reading, writing, sometimes just staring at the ceiling, as if watching time pass. He was invisible to governments, but visible to those who looked closely. And perhaps this subtle visibility is the most human thing one can be. In a world where almost everything is urgency and haste, Mehran was constancy. A face that didn't change, a body that didn't run, a name no one could pronounce correctly, but everyone recognized. He never asked to be a symbol, never sought fame, but he became a kind of poetic presence, a reminder that the modern world, as efficient as it tries to be, still leaves people forgotten in its corners. And yet, these people survive, persist, create from nothing a kind of home. Mehran was, at the same time, an anomaly and an inevitable presence. He was what everyone avoided becoming, but also what everyone learned to respect. Perhaps the subtlest part of suffering is when it stops hurting and starts to feel natural. Mehran Karimi Nasseri arrived at Terminal 1 of Charles de Gaulle Airport thinking he would stay there for a few hours, or days, at most weeks. But time passed almost imperceptibly, like water slipping through one's fingers. And, in a strange way, what was meant to be temporary became routine. And routine, as it always does, took root. He began to call that corner his own, the bench by the glass wall, the table where he kept his papers, the suitcases, always arranged with precision, as if they were furniture, one on each side, a kind of invisible frame for the small world he had built within the larger world that ignored him. There, Mehran organized his life. He had set times to get up, set times to walk, set times to write. Over time, he learned which bathrooms were cleaner, which hours were quieter, and which staff members were willing to pretend that he wasn't a problem. He began to memorize the sounds. He knew the rhythm of the announcements. He knew when the hall would be crowded. He knew the smell of every terminal restaurant. He knew where the light was softer, where it was possible to escape, for a few moments, the cold glow of the LED panels. The constant noise stopped bothering him. It became white noise, like the sound of the sea for someone who lives by the coast. A constant presence, but one that lulls the inner silence rather than breaking it. The suitcases became wardrobe, library, and pantry, each organized according to a personal logic. Clothes folded carefully, papers stored in plastic envelopes, old photographs, letters, newspaper clippings about him. All of this inside a terminal. And, absurd as it may seem, there was a kind of peace there. Not peace in the sense of comfort, but peace in the sense of surrender. Mehran no longer fought against time. He no longer panicked with each passing month. He no longer asked, "When will I leave?" That question no longer mattered. He was there, whole, present, and the terminal, built for quick flows of people, adapted to his slowness. If before he stood out, now, he was part of it. It was as if Charles de Gaulle itself had absorbed his presence. Like a tree growing among concrete stones. No one planted it. No one expected it. But it was there. A silent tree. Lonely. Persistent. Mehran became the only official resident of a place designed for no one to live in. And gradually, he himself realized it. He began signing letters with the airport's address. Terminal 1, Departure Zone, International Area. A place where time has no calendar. Where days are marked only by shift changes. Over the years, the surroundings changed. Staff members retired. Restaurants were renovated. Some areas got new signage. But he remained, aging on the same bench, with the same posture, the same gaze that seemed to pierce through time, and a lightness that did not come from joy, but from acceptance. His days became predictable. and at the same time impenetrable. No one knew what went on in his mind. No one knew if he dreamed of freedom, or if, deep down, that limbo was all he had ever known. And perhaps that is the most moving part of his story. The wait stretched so long that it stopped being a wait. It became a state. It became home, like a castaway building a house on a deserted island, like someone planting flowers on a vacant lot, like someone turning emptiness into permanence. Mehran no longer lived in the terminal. He was the terminal, in a place where everything is transient. Mehran Karimi Nasseri found permanence in what slips through the fingers. Words. Writing, for him, was not just a distraction. It was breathing, a silent way of existing, without needing permission. On the bench he called home, among carefully arranged suitcases, half-read newspapers, and reused bottles. He also kept loose papers, sheets yellowed by time, others torn from magazines, some carefully stored in improvised folders, others simply piled up, as if they had grown there, like leaves in a forgotten garden. And there, with a simple pen, he wrote, not letters, not conventional diaries, but fragments, broken thoughts, reflections on time, on the people passing by in a hurry, on his own identity, so often questioned by the stamps at the border. He wrote as one sews pieces of a torn cloth, each line an attempt to reclaim a part of himself, to remember that even without a homeland, even without a home, even without a defined name, he was still someone who thought, and thinking, at times, was his way of fighting. Some terminal employees said he was always scribbling, spending hours in silence, staring at the paper, as if the entire world could fit there. And, in a way, it did, because writing was also a way to travel. While people around him rushed toward boarding gates, Mehran boarded a journey within himself. With the pen in his hand, he could go anywhere. Back to his childhood in Iran, walk through the streets of London he never knew, imagine Belgium that had rejected him, and even create countries where bureaucracy did not hurt. He drew possible worlds. And perhaps without knowing it, he was creating his own internal constitution. His words required no passport, needed no visa, nor were they trapped in immigration offices. It was the only place where he was finally free. It is said that he even wrote his autobiography, simply titled The Terminal Man, a title that, in itself, carries weight, not just because it recalls the place where he spent almost 2 decades, but because terminal also means end, and Mehran was always on the edge of something, on the verge of leaving, on the verge of disappearing, on the verge of being recognized or forgotten. His writing, then, was both anchor and sail, what kept him there, and what allowed him to drift. Many of his texts were never read. Some, perhaps, have been lost over time. Others still rest in cardboard boxes, kept by curious onlookers or researchers. But for him, perhaps, writing didn't even need a reader. The act alone was enough. The gesture of moving the pen across the page, and feeling that, however small that world might be, there was still choice. There was still a voice. In his writings, Mehran spoke about identity, about how it is possible to exist even when no one acknowledges your name, about the void that forms when documents say the opposite of what you feel, and about how, sometimes to be someone, it is enough to keep telling yourself that you are. The loose sheets he kept were seeds, small hopes scattered on concrete soil. They didn't bloom for everyone to see, but for those who paid attention, there was poetry there, a melancholic poetry, but also stubborn, resilient. And while the terminal followed its routine, with flights being announced, luggage misplaced, and coffee served at high prices, there he was, head down, pen between fingers, and mind flying. Who are we, when no one can prove we exist? Mehran Karimi Nasseri had a body. He had a story. He had memories and scars. He even had a chair where he rested night after night, surrounded by suitcases that had begun to look like furniture in a home that wasn't a home. But there was something he didn't have: documents. And without them, to the outside world, he was just a shadow, one among many. Have you ever thought about that? The idea that everything you are could suddenly disappear. If the papers that identify you were lost, destroyed, or simply refused. That's what happened to him. Mehran claimed to have been born in Iran. He said he was expelled for political reasons, that his voice opposed the ruling powers. He then reportedly applied for asylum in Belgium, obtained refugee status, and years later, lost that very status, when, in search of his mother, he embarked on a journey that ended in France, or rather, at Terminal 1 of Charles de Gaulle Airport. There, he discovered that he no longer had a passport, nor a visa, nor a recognized birth certificate, and Belgium refused to take him back. France, for its part, could not deport him. After all, there was nowhere to send him, and without legal entry into French soil, he could not freely move outside the terminal either. Mehran, then, remained between worlds, between borders, between sentences that said a lot, but told him nothing about who he was. He was labeled as stateless, undocumented, an apatrid man, but no one asked how he felt. Without papers, he could not rent a room, could not open a bank account, could not buy a train ticket, could not even leave the airport and walk in a random park. He was not a prisoner, but he was not free either. He was a suspended being, present but unrecognized, and yet, Mehran clung to what he believed to be his origin. He insisted on his identity, repeated his name as if trying to anchor himself in time, refused distorted versions, or attempts to label him for diplomatic convenience. It was as if he were telling the world, if I cannot be accepted, I will still exist. Bureaucracy, which is often invisible to many, became a concrete prison for him, not made of bars, but of forms, stamps, needs, and omissions. And there is something profoundly human in all of this. The fragility of existence, the thin line between being someone and being nothing. Because what separated Mehran from any other passenger in the terminal was not his appearance, nor his gentle voice, nor his suitcases, but the absence of something that would fit inside an envelope, a document that said, "This man exists," and as absurd as it may seem, in a world dominated by systems, databases, and barcodes, a handwritten name simply was not enough. Often, he asked himself, "Am I Mehran Karimi Nasseri? Am I Sir Alfred? Am I just a number in some forgotten file?" There were days when he seemed confused, others when he was very sure of what he said. It was as if, little by little, his identity was also being eroded by time and indifference. Even so, he resisted. He refused to leave the terminal under names he did not recognize. He refused to accept documents that said less about him than his own words. To the world, it seemed stubbornness. To him, perhaps it was the last thread of dignity, because accepting any random name, or a convenient nationality, would mean admitting that none of what he had lived before mattered. And he was still the boy who grew up in Iran, still the student who believed in justice, still the man searching for his mother, still, above all, someone without documents, but with a story, without a homeland, but with roots, without a name in the records, but with a voice, in a place built for transit, where people appear and disappear in the blink of an eye. The idea of social interaction seems impossible. But for Mehran Karimi Nasseri, this silent and fragmented coexistence became his daily life. The airport staff, those hurried and impassive faces we see, were, for him, the only real interlocutors in this ephemeral world. They didn't just pass by. They recognized the presence of that man frozen in time. Security guards cast quick glances, sometimes a discreet nod. Cleaning staff would leave cups of water and small snacks. Silent gestures of care that were never requested. Among the crowd, Mehran was a constant presence, a fixed point amid the chaos of human flow. Passengers, on the other hand, had varied reactions. To many, he was just a shadow, a passing curiosity. Some stopped to talk. Others averted their eyes with a mix of pity and discomfort. On certain occasions, families left behind forgotten toys. Children asked their mothers, "Why doesn't that man leave?" And for Mehran, these small interactions were a form of connection. Yet there was an invisible barrier. The invisibility imposed by his lack of documents, reinforced by bureaucracy, and consolidated by society. He was, at the same time, seen and ignored, present, yet absent. This tension defined his social life in the terminal. He was a familiar stranger, a real ghost. Over the years, Mehran developed his own way of relating. Silent, polite, always respecting others' space, but available to those who showed interest. There was care in the way he greeted people, gentleness in his gestures, infinite patience. And perhaps this patience is what surprises most. Because waiting is an act that, for most, has limits. But Mehran waited for years, decades. He waited without losing composure. He waited without becoming bitter. The staff learned to read his signals. They knew when he needed help, when he preferred to be alone. It was a coexistence made of shared silences, of small exchanges that required no words. Thus, in that environment of constant transit, Mehran built a paradoxical social life. He was surrounded by people, yet lived in near absolute solitude. And this solitude, however, did not erase him. On the contrary, it made him an almost mythical figure, a presence many said they missed, even without knowing exactly why. After all, those who get used to not seeing someone suddenly feel the emptiness that their absence creates. Charles de Gaulle Airport is a universe of its own, a space of passage, bustling and fleeting, where thousands of lives cross paths every day. But for Mehran Karimi Nasseri, it was more than that. It was the only world. When everything around seems uncertain, when documents fail to define who you are, the physical space you inhabit takes on immense weight, and the terminal becomes both a fortress and a prison, a shelter and a confinement at the same time. There, among boarding gates and long corridors, Mehran found his territory, a place where, despite the imposed invisibility, he could exist in his purest form. The constant noise of announcements, the artificial lights that never go out, the smell of fast food, the sense that time does not pass, but merely happens. All of this became part of his life, and he learned to read this world silently. He knows which gate is emptier in the afternoon, which corridor is quieter for a pause. When the security guards change shifts, the best moment to avoid crowds. Every detail was a map for survival. And, within this confined space, Mehran wove his existence. He was no longer just a stranger passing through. He was a resident, even without an official address. The airport, for him, was not just a place. It was a refuge, a space where he could simply be himself. Without papers, without borders, without the urgency of the outside world. Outside, there were countries, governments, laws. Inside, there were routines, familiar faces, rules of their own. Still, it was not a home in the traditional sense. There was no privacy. There was no true rest. Fatigue came, but the light never completely went out. Sleep was fragmented, often interrupted by announcements and footsteps. But Mehran learned to find comfort in imperfection, in the constant sound that lulls, in the movement that never stops, in the certainty that, even invisible to the world, here he was recognized. He was the man who waited, the man who resisted, the man who made the airport his home. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of this story, that even in the most unexpected places, even in the most difficult situations, human beings find a way to exist, to adapt, to create meaning, while thousands of passengers pass through that terminal every day. Mehran remains still and constant, a fixed point in a world in transit. And in that stillness, he teaches us something about time, identity, and hope. In the relentless movement of the airport, Between arrivals and departures, there are small actions that often go unnoticed. For most, they are just details. A glass of water left behind, a kind glance, a discreet smile. But for Mehran Karimi Nasseri, these small gestures were much more than details. They were the invisible network that kept him connected to the world. Terminal staff, security guards, attendants, and cleaners, without ever coordinating, formed around him a kind of silent community. They were not friends in the conventional sense, nor relatives, but they became his support family. Each gesture carried a profound meaning. An attendant who left a sandwich nearby, a security guard who averted his gaze to give him privacy, a cleaner who safeguarded his few belongings so they wouldn't be thrown away. These small acts of kindness accumulated over the years, creating a safe space amid the impersonal flow of the airport. And Mehran knew it. He perceived the kindness even when no words were spoken. It was a silent dialogue made of glances and actions. This invisible network protected him from total loneliness, from absolute abandonment, because, despite his unusual circumstances, he was not completely alone. This quiet coexistence reminds us that, even in the harshest situations, humanity can manifest in small gestures. Gestures that may not save the world, perhaps, but save someone. And maybe that is the greatest lesson Mehran leaves us: the importance of simple care, discreet empathy, silent presence. In a place where no one should belong, he found a space to exist, not because of documents or laws, but because of these invisible gestures. Living in an airport for nearly 2 decades is not just a story of survival, but also of constant resilience. Mehran Karimi Nasseri, trapped between lost documents and invisible borders, faced daily challenges that most people could never imagine. For him, routine was marked by small obstacles that accumulated and demanded adaptation. From the difficulty of maintaining hygiene in a public space not designed for living, to the struggle to secure minimal food and rest amidst the noise and relentless movement. Physical discomfort was often only the beginning. There was the psychological weight of uncertainty, the slow erosion that corrodes hope, and at the same time, strengthens the need to stay strong. Mehran discovered that the mind needed exercises to avoid succumbing to sadness or despair. Writing, small daily rituals, the silent acknowledgement from the staff, these all became anchors that kept him connected to life. Even so, the terminal was a hostile space. There were days when he was summoned for interrogations or official interviews, moments that brought palpable tension and a cruel reminder of his liminal condition. But Mehran never stopped resisting. Resisting forgetfulness, imposed invisibility, the denial of his official existence. His presence was a silent testimony that even in extreme situations, a human being can maintain dignity. And it is this resilience that silently resonates at the heart of his story. Because living in limbo is not simply being trapped, it is also choosing to exist despite everything. The story of Mehran Karimi Nasseri is not just the story of a man who lived in an airport. It is also a mirror of the modern world, a reflection of the complexities of borders, bureaucracy, and identity. During his nearly 18 years in Terminal 1 of Charles de Gaulle, Mehran became a symbol of something greater, of the silent struggle of stateless people, of forgotten refugees, of those who live in the shadows of systems. His case drew international media attention, inspiring books, films, and debates on human rights. But beyond the headlines, his legacy is deeper. He invites us to think about what it means to belong, about the importance of documents, but also about the fragility of these definitions in the face of human reality. Mehran reminds us that behind every story of exclusion, there is a person with dreams, fears, memories, and desires. And the absence of a piece of paper does not erase existence. In the airport, he was seen as an anomaly. But, in many ways, his story is universal. Because all of us, at some point, can feel displaced, invisible, trapped in our own limbos. His legacy is an invitation to empathy, to patience, to understanding, and perhaps to a more peaceful sleep, knowing that even in the midst of chaos, there are stories that endure, that remain, that make us reflect. After nearly 18 years living in an airport, Mehran Karimi Nasseri finally left Terminal 1 of Charles de Gaulle. A moment that, for many, seemed unlikely, almost unbelievable. But the end of this wait was not simply a physical departure. It was, above all, the closing of a long and complex chapter, a life suspended between borders and bureaucracy, an existence marked by invisibility and resilience. When he finally received documents that allowed him to leave, he was not just a man free to walk the world. He was someone who carried on his skin and in his soul the marks of a long wait. The airport, which had been both his prison and his home, was left behind, like a chapter that had ended. But the memories, the stories, the dreams remained. He began living in a place where he could finally have an address. Yet the process of reintegration was not simple. Physical freedom does not erase years of isolation and uncertainty. Mehran had to relearn how to exist in the world that had left him behind. A world where time moves differently, where people have past, present, and future, not just a wait that seems never-ending. His case continues to serve as a warning about the challenges faced by stateless people and refugees, about the importance of humane and compassionate policies, about how bureaucracy can sometimes become a greater barrier than any physical border. And for those of us who hear his story, it is an invitation to reflect on the fragility of the human condition, on the strength of hope, and on the quiet power of resilience. Now, as we close this story, we can close our eyes with the sense that even in the most absurd situations, there is room for dignity, for humanity, for peaceful sleep. Thank you for being here, listening to this story. If it touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Like the video to help this story reach more people who, like you, seek to understand the strange and beautiful aspects of human existence. And subscribe to continue exploring together these tales that help calm the mind and the soul. Now, take a deep breath and let this meaning settle gently in your mind. In the next topic, we will explore how Argleton connects with other ghost town stories around the world. Good night.